Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're exploring The Wizard of Oz and Wicked. You've sent in a really interesting mix of articles and excerpts on this, so clearly you're ready to go beyond just the surface of these stories. You know we're going to uncover those hidden layers, the political and social messages that might surprise you. I've got to admit, when I saw some of these sources, Wizard of Oz is a political allegory. Animal rights and Wicked, I was hooked.
Both of these books are incredibly rich with symbolism and deeper meaning. Think of this deep dive as your guide to understanding those layers.
All right. Let's start with the original Wizard of Oz. You mentioned it being a populist allegory. Could you break that down for us? What exactly is populism?
Populism was a political movement that gained a lot of traction in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Essentially, it was a movement of the people, particularly farmers, who felt like their voices weren't being heard by the government and the elite. They were facing economic hardship and wanted change, like fairer prices for their crops and a move away from the gold standard, which they felt benefited the wealthy at their expense.
So how on earth does Dorothy and her journey to Oz connect to all of that?
This is where things get interesting. Many scholars believe that L. Frank Baum, who wrote the book during this era, was cleverly weaving these political debates into his story. Imagine Dorothy as the average American, maybe even specifically a farmer, who just wants to get back to a place of stability, just like those struggling farmers wanted economic security.
Okay, so Kansas represents that stability, but what about the Yellow Brick Road itself?
Think about it. The Yellow Brick Road leads to the Emerald City, a place of supposed wealth and power. Some believe it represents the gold standard, which the populace saw as a symbol of economic inequality. They felt like it was this path that was paved for the benefit of the wealthy while leaving others behind.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So if Dorothy represents the common person, what about her companions? Are the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion also part of this political allegory?
Absolutely. They each represent different aspects of the populist movement. Take the Scarecrow, for example. He seems simple on the surface, but he's actually quite intelligent. He represents the farmers themselves, often dismissed as uneducated, but actually incredibly resourceful and clever.
That makes sense. But the Tin Man, how does he fit into this?
Imagine being stuck, unable to move, your body slowly rusting away. That's the Tin Man.
Yeah.
Scholars see him as a symbol of the industrial worker, someone whose job has become so repetitive and soul-crushing that they feel more like a machine than a human being. He represents the dehumanizing effects of industrialization, a major concern during this era.
That's a really powerful image. So if the Scarecrow is the farmer and the Tin Man is the industrial worker, does that make the Cowardly Lion the politician?
You got it. He's often interpreted as William Jennings Bryan, a prominent populist leader. Bryan was a powerful speaker and advocate for the movement, but some felt he lacked the courage to enact real change.
So we've got Dorothy, the common person seeking stability. We've got the Scarecrow representing the farmers, the Tin Man symbolizing the industrial worker, and the Lion standing in for a prominent populist leader. What about the wizard himself? Where does he fit into all of this?
The wizard is a fascinating character. He's this powerful figure who promises solutions but ultimately can't deliver. He's all smoke and mirrors, which some believe is a critique of politicians who rely on empty rhetoric and grand promises to gain and maintain power.
It's like Baum is saying, don't be fooled by those in positions of authority. They might not have all the answers they claim to have.
Exactly. And it's a theme that still resonates today. We're often presented with figures who promise simple solutions to complex problems. But the reality is much more complicated.
So The Wizard of Oz isn't just a children's story about a girl and her dog. It's a reflection of a specific moment in American history, grappling with issues like economic inequality, the rise of industrialization, and the power dynamics between the people and those in authority.
Precisely. And while Baum's approach was subtle, Gregory Maguire takes these ideas and makes them much more explicit in Wicked.
Before we jump into Wicked, I want to go back to Oz for a minute. We've been talking about the populist allegory, but you also mentioned that the book reflects the anxieties surrounding industrialization. Where do we see that in the story beyond the Tin Man?
Think about the stark contrast between the Emerald City and places like Munchkinland. The Emerald City, with its gleaming green buildings and advanced technology, represents the allure and wealth of the industrialized urban centers. On the other hand, Munchkinland, while charming, is portrayed as more rural and less developed, representing the areas that were often left behind in the rush towards industrialization.
So, is it a stretch to think that the Wicked Witch of the West who rules over Munchkinland and exploits its inhabitants, might represent the forces that profited from industrialization at the expense of the working class?
Not at all. Remember, good literature is open to multiple interpretations. The Wicked Witch could represent the greed and exploitation that often came with rapid industrial growth. She hoards wealth, controls the Munchkins, and even tries to steal Dorothy's ruby slippers, which, if we're sticking with the gold standard metaphor, represent a form of economic power. And that's where Wicked takes these themes of power, inequality, and social commentary to a whole new level.
You're right. I was blown away by the excerpts you sent on this. Maguire really doesn't shy away from tackling complex issues head on. It's like he took all the subtle hints from Baum and turned them into a full-blown social critique.
Exactly. While The Wizard of Oz might leave room for interpretation, Wicked lays its cards on the table. Elphaba's story is a powerful exploration of prejudice, the abuse of power, and what it truly means to be labeled wicked.
One thing that stood out to me was the role of animals in Wicked. They're clearly more than just cute sidekicks in this story.
Absolutely. Maguire uses the animals as a powerful metaphor for any marginalized or oppressed group. Think about it. They're denied basic rights, their voices are silenced, and they're subjected to cruel treatment by those in power. Elphaba's fight for animal rights becomes a much broader fight for social justice.
So, we can see parallels to real-world struggles against discrimination based on race, religion, gender, and so much more. It's like Maguire saying, look, the way we treat those who are different from us says a lot about who we are as a society.
Exactly. And it challenges us to examine our own biases and prejudices, to consider how we might be complicit in systems that perpetuate inequality.
Speaking of systems of power, how does the wizard himself figure into Wicked? We've already seen that Baum presented him as a bit of a charlatan, but it sounds like Maguire takes things even further.
Maguire's wizard is far from the benevolent, if slightly bumbling, figure we see in The Wizard of Oz. He's portrayed as a manipulative and power-hungry leader who will stop at nothing to maintain control. Think propaganda, surveillance, silencing dissent. He's got it all.
You know, when you describe the wizard that way, using propaganda, silencing dissent, it's hard not to think about real-world dictatorships. Is Maguire intentionally drawing those parallels, do you think?
I think it's very deliberate. By presenting the wizard as this almost totalitarian figure, Maguire forces us to confront the dangers of unchecked power and the ways in which leaders can manipulate and exploit others to achieve their own ends. It's a theme that's unfortunately all too relevant in our world today.
It's a stark reminder that the fight for freedom, justice, and equality is never truly over, and that we always need to be vigilant against those who would abuse their power.
Absolutely. And Wicked goes beyond simply pointing fingers at those in power. It also explores the complexities of power itself, particularly through Elphaba's journey.
That's something I found really fascinating. Elphaba isn't just a one-dimensional villain. She's driven by a desire to do good, to fight for justice, but she also struggles with her own flaws and fears.
What's fascinating here is how Maguire explores the idea that even those who fight for good causes can be tempted by power, and how that power can corrupt even the best intentions. Elphaba's internal struggle with this is something that resonates with anyone who's ever tried to make a difference in the world.
It makes you think about the challenges of activism and social change. How do you create a better world without becoming the very thing you're fighting against? It's a really thought-provoking aspect of the story.
It certainly is, and it adds another layer of complexity to the question of who is truly wicked in this story. We're led to believe that Elphaba is the villain, but is she really? Or is she simply a product of a corrupt system? A system that ultimately turns against her.
We've also got notes here about how Elphaba is an outsider from the very beginning, even before she's labeled wicked. Her green skin, her magical abilities, her outspoken nature, she never quite fits in. Is that part of Maguire's commentary as well?
It's a crucial part of the story. Elphaba's otherness is something that makes her both powerful and vulnerable. It allows her to see the world differently, to challenge the status quo, but it also makes her a target for fear and prejudice.
It's like Maguire is saying that those who are different, who don't conform to societal norms, are often the ones who are most likely to see the injustices in the world and to speak out against them. But they're also the ones who are most likely to be silenced or punished for doing so.
Exactly. And that theme of being judged and ostracized for who you are is something that continues to resonate deeply with people today, whether it's based on race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or simply having a different way of thinking. We've all experienced the feeling of not fitting in.
It makes me think about the importance of empathy and understanding, of challenging our own biases and preconceived notions about others. It's so easy to label someone as different or other, But that label can have real-world consequences.
It's a powerful reminder that we should always strive to see the world through the eyes of others, to understand their experiences and perspectives, even if they're different from our own.
It's amazing how these stories, even though they're set in fantasy worlds, can hold up such a powerful mirror to our own reality. We've talked about populism, industrialization, social justice, and the complexities of power, all themes that resonate deeply with the challenges we face today.
And that's what makes both The Wizard of Oz and Wicked so enduring. They're not just entertaining stories. They're works of art that continue to spark important conversations and challenge us to think critically about the world around us.
You mentioned earlier that these books feel incredibly relevant today. What are some specific examples that come to mind?
Well, take the treatment of the animals in Wicked, for instance. Their struggle for basic rights and recognition mirrors the discrimination and prejudice that many groups still face in our world, whether it's based on race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation,
Yeah.
or anything else that makes someone different. The tactics of oppression, the fear-mongering, the silencing of dissent, the dehumanization are eerily similar.
It's that age-old tactic of creating an other, someone to blame and fear, to divide and conquer. We see it happen all the time, unfortunately.
And then there's the wizard himself. His abuse of power, his reliance on propaganda and control, reminds us of the very real dangers of authoritarianism, which, as we know, is unfortunately making a comeback in various parts of the world.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight for freedom, justice, and equality is never truly over, and that we always need to be vigilant against those who would seek to exploit and control others.
Absolutely. And Wicked also speaks to the ongoing conversations we're having about identity and self-expression. Elphaba's struggle to define herself on her own terms, to resist the labels and expectations that are imposed on her, resonates deeply with so many people today who are fighting for the right to be who they truly are, even if that means challenging societal norms and expectations.
It's a reminder that true freedom comes not only from external liberation, but also from internal liberation.
Yeah.
The freedom to embrace your authentic self, even if that self doesn't fit neatly into predefined categories.
Precisely. And both of these stories, in their own ways, challenge us to question those categories, to look beyond surface appearances, and recognize the inherent worth and complexity of every individual.
So listener name, as you revisit The Wizard of Oz and Wicked through the lens of these sources, I hope you'll keep some of these questions in mind. Who has power? Who is marginalized? Who gets to decide who's good and who's wicked? And how do these stories reflect the challenges and complexities of our own world? We've talked a lot about how Elphaba is labeled wicked, but does wicked make you question if the wizard, or even Glinda, are truly good? What does that say about how we judge people in our own world?
That's the beauty of Maguire's work. He doesn't offer easy answers. He forces us to confront our own assumptions about good and evil, to recognize that things are rarely black and white. Everyone has the potential for both darkness and light, and sometimes the line between hero and villain is blurry at best.
It's a reminder that the world isn't neatly divided into simple categories. People are complex, motivations are messy, and sometimes those we perceive as good are upholding systems that perpetuate injustice. It's a challenging thought, but it's one worth wrestling with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's what great art does. It makes us question. It makes us uncomfortable. And it helps us see the world in a more nuanced and insightful way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into The Wizard of Oz and Wicked. We hope we've given you some new perspectives on these classic stories and some food for thought about the enduring power of art to reflect and challenge the world around us. Keep those brains buzzing. And we'll catch you next time for another adventure in uncovering the hidden depths of the stories we think we know.